Hi, my name is Shani, and welcome to the Experienced Designers podcast, where we explore the human experience, what it is, and how we might create better ones for ourselves and for others. As the saying goes, the only constant is change. But even so, dealing with it as people or as a company or as a collective of any kind can feel really challenging and daunting for most of us. So, what can we do to make change manageable as individuals or as leaders? What capabilities do we need to develop and put into practice? How do we transform that sense of resistance and friction into a feeling of enthusiasm and opportunity when we meet change? This is what Alex Budak and myself discuss. Alex teaches change at Berkeley Haas School of Business and has recently released the book Becoming a Changemaker. He brings a lot of practical tips and exciting angles to reframe how we see and approach change. Let's jump in. I'm super happy to finally get to dig into change with you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this as well.
So we've already met somehow previously in our career about 10 years ago. So it was a while ago. But I think the theme that's kind of stuck, and when I went back to look at your career since, then change is really the word that stands out. You've led incubators on change. You've written columns about it. You teach change. You've written a book very recently that you released, Becoming a Changemaker. Um, so I'm always curious about this. What is it about change that kind of pulls you in? Why do you think you're on this path?
What a fun question. And we should also say that you and I first met through work with an organization called Reach for Change. So even in the
Yes.
name of the organization itself was change. Um, I guess it comes from this belief in the power of tomorrow and this idea that tomorrow can always be better than today. And I think I find it exhilarating and fascinating and scary and all those things. But to think about like what could be next, I love thinking about that, and I love helping people embrace their readiness to sort of think about and achieve change. So you're right that the sort of red thread to everything that I've done in writing, speaking, teaching, organizations, it's always been change. But I think it's really with that idea of like, what could tomorrow be like? How can we play a role in shaping it?
That's amazing. And I also think it's interesting because I've had actually conversations even just this week where we talked about kind of the other side of that coin is the non-excitement for change, which is also very much existent in this world, which is full of it. And we all react really differently to it. So I think it's always exciting to speak to somebody who has such an enthusiasm for change. So I always start really big with this kind of question about the human experience because we all experience lots of change. And I think it's definitely maybe at least felt like an escalation in the last few years. Whether or not it's been one, time will tell. But um, it's very much feeling like a part of our normal setting nowadays. I think that, whether it's at work or private life or in the world around us, there is a lot of changes to deal with. So I'm just really curious, just because of your kind of in depth work with this, what do you see as a good experience of change? How can we do change to make it feel manageable to
Oh,
people?
it's a great question, but I'll start with some sort of big picture things as well, and then we'll
Yeah,
get into
please
some
do.
details. So, I mean, first, I think it's important to recognize that humans tend to like things the way that they are. So, there's something called the status quo bias, which social science tells us is a very real thing. Behavioral economists Samuelson and Zeckhauser basically proved that people tend to overvalue what they already have. And that means that most people in most situations will probably be scared of change. One of the most important reframes that I had around change is, I think you began the conversation talking about how I see opportunity in change, but also not everyone does. The former dean of the Haas School of Business, where I teach at UC Berkeley, he helped me sort of change the way I think about this. He said, let's start seeing resistance as rational. that when people are scared of change, that's rational. That's a totally normal thing to think about. Maybe you've been part of change efforts before and they failed. Maybe you so want to believe that change is possible, but you just don't have the track record that shows that it is. Or maybe you're just kind of comfortable and the unknown scares you. That's totally fine. And so I think it's good to first ground us and saying that a lot of change is happening and that we tend to like things the way that they are. And so let's not blame ourselves if we feel differently about that, or if change doesn't come perhaps as naturally as sometimes it does to me. Now, in terms of what a good change effort can look like, I think there's a few components. But first, a huge part of being a change maker is having a sense of agency. I think where change can feel really scary is when you feel like change is happening to you, where you have no control, you have no say. All of this change is happening all around you, and you're just merely trying to hold on for the ride. And so I think one of the most important shifts we can make is, as you suggested, we can't slow down change. I think change is only accelerating. And so it isn't about stopping change, but rather it's about changing our relationship to the concept and not just trying to merely survive change, but can we become so comfortable with it that we can navigate, shape, and steer change and make it positive for ourselves and for those around us?
Mm, I love that. And it immediately makes me think of things that I've learned throughout my years also with neuro leadership, and how, as you're saying, resistance isn't just rational, it's also natural. It's our natural reaction to things that throw us off or throw us out of our normal, is to actually start feeling that resistance and go, I don't feel sure about this. And I think a mantra that I learned with this is also that it's not so much about whether you feel resistance, because you're likely to. The question is how long you stay with your resistance. And some people are then really good at going, okay, and quite quickly moving on to the next thing. And other people feel more rattled by it, and each is natural.
Mm.
And also, I love this word agency that you brought up. And it's funny because I had another conversation this week exactly around that agency and having a sense of, yeah, being in control, as much as I don't necessarily like the word control, but just having a say, I think is super important. I'm really curious because we both work in quite big settings, and there's always this like parameter of the individual and the kind of collective space, the company or the workplace, or whatever that is. What do you think each of those can do to like move into that space or sentiment of opportunity and agency? What can an individual do to do it, and what can, whether it's a workplace or something else, do to help people get a sense of agency?
Yeah, and there's a fascinating interplay between the two. I think there's a cultural component. So I'm coming to
Mm.
you from the Silicon Valley Bay Area, which is often hyper individualistic. You and I met working in Sweden, which is much more collective and thinking about sort of the team. And I think there's a balance there between both of them.
Mm.
And I think we can over index on either, which is no good. And so instead, the question is like, how do we think about the best of both?
Mm.
So in terms of thinking about like the individual's ability to lead change, I mean, here we think about that sense of like having the skills, having the mindset, and then also having the courage to step up and say, hey, let's do something about this. But I think at its best, those individuals will also have a sense of the greater whole, the greater context. The best change making, I think, comes in a team sport. We may like to over glorify the individual, the lone contributor, but realistically, no change happens by themselves. And so, for instance, if you're trying to lead change within a company, can you be conscious of the culture and the institution in which you're trying to lead change? In the book, I tell the story of Sam McCracken. Sam is a member of the Sioux and Assiniboine tribes of northeastern Montana in the United States, and also general manager at Nike. He came up with the idea for the Nike N7 line. So it's an indigenous inspired line within Nike, the proceeds of which will go to support indigenous youth, communities like his own, and support them in having more access to sport and recreation. And when he did this, of course, he's the change maker, sort of standing up and leading change within the company. But he did so grounded in Nike's values. Nike has what they call their 11 maxims, sort of 11 ways of doing business. And he said as he made the pitch, he grounded them in all 11. So in making the pitch, he was advocating for his community. How did he know it was a change worth pursuing? Well, in his own words, he said that I heard there was a need in my community and I listened. So he is deeply connected with his community, but also embedded himself within Nike. He found there's 11 ways that Nike likes to think about business, and they did all 11. And then from the company organization lens, let's think about how do you bring others into the change with you? Patty Sanchez wrote in Harvard Business Review, finding that 50% of C-suite executives, when they lead change, they don't actually take into account how that change will be perceived by people on the front lines. So in other words, they're in their office, they come up with this is the perfect change effort, they announce it, they roll it out to the company, and 1 out of every 2 hasn't thought about, well, how will someone that's 5, 6, 7, 8 layers of authority removed from me be thinking about this? How will someone who actually interacts with our customers be thinking about this? And so I think for the institution, for the organization, got to put a lot more empathy into the change, right? So you may be leading change because you're worried about the bottom line or the stock price or pressure from your board, but that may not matter too much to the frontline person who has to deal with a lot of the change on a day-to-day basis. And so can you use empathy to understand where someone else might be coming from, not just to communicate the change, but also ideally to formulate the change.
Hmm. What does that look like? Have you seen any good examples of that?
So a very practical thing that when I work with executives, I love advising them on is to build advisory boards. So we often have advisory boards of people who are famous and have big names and so on. Build an advisory board that represents the diversity of teammates in your company. So that
Mm.
means race, gender, experience, age, but also geography, language that they speak, and start running decisions through them. We all have blind spots. So the question isn't, do you have blind spots? Because of course you do. But instead, it's about what do you do with that? And can you proactively bring people into the change with you? When you do, and what I've found in working with executive teams is when they do, it's awkward for them at first when they're like, hey, we want to do this thing, but what do you think? But once they do, they start realizing that there's all these blind spots. They get all kinds of new intelligence, cultural intelligence, corporate intelligence that they wouldn't have otherwise had. It's a much more inclusive way to lead, but also it's a much more effective way to lead.
Mm. I love that. And it really resonates with what we work with, which is experience design, which also has its base and its very starting point always in empathy. And actually, empathy in itself also sometimes generates resistance, not just the change, but actually even going to listen to people or um, operating from that place of inclusivity and um, less assumption. I've also experienced that to generate resistance because we're so used to going about our processes in very specific ways.
Yeah, isn't it funny when the empathy looks like, okay, I'm going to talk with this person, but also I'm going to prove to them why I'm right. That's not really empathy. Like the point of empathy is to honestly
No.
just listen and try to understand where they're coming from, put yourself in their shoes, and then you go together from there.
Mm. Then you have a starting point in empathy and you're listening. What have you seen to be more successful ways to create then that engagement or that movement from that point? Because it's one thing to listen and just create maybe a sense of trust and a sense of dialogue, but then change is also about movement. So how do you go from there?
So one of my favorite pieces of social science research ever came from Damon Centola at University of Pennsylvania, and it's about tipping points in social norms. And so he and his colleagues looked to see what percent of people in a group need to be on board with a new norm to make it likely that a new norm will take hold. And I don't know about you or people listening, I would have guessed at least 50%. I would have guessed probably 60, 70%. But no, the data show that the magic tipping point is about 25%. So way, way fewer people than one might think. And so one of the things I often see is that people trying to lead change try to get 100% of people all on board all at once. But if you think about it, if you only need about 1/4 of folks on board, well, then that changes your strategy a little bit. The consulting firm Nobel, that's Nobl, did an interesting piece, which is about the 3 types of people you meet while leading change. And so you've got your champions, you got your fence sitters, and your cynics. So they say with the champions, get them involved early, delegate to them, make them feel part of the change with you. And so that's, again, going back to the idea of control. You're loosening control a little bit, bringing others into the change, make them feel like they're champions. Then there's the fence sitters. And they say we tend to spend a lot of time worrying about the fence sitters, but instead Nobel says, no, forget about them for a little bit. They'll come around if you can build enough momentum. Instead, there's the cynics. And this goes back to what we started our conversation with. They define cynics in, I think, a really refreshing way. They say that often a cynic is just a disappointed idealist, right? That idea that resistance is rational or even, as you say, natural. And so instead, can you listen to their concerns? Can you find ways to bring them on board? Can you iterate with them and make them feel included? And when you do, if you've delegated to the champions, you've heard out the cynics, perhaps gotten some of them on board, then the fence sitters will come on also. One more technique that I found that's helpful is sometimes you want to ask for less. So in working with one executive leader, he's trying to lead kind of a cultural transformation at work. And there were a number of people who were excited, but also a number of people who were really not excited by it, let's say, put it that way. And so he made an ask of the people who were his strongest critics, basically saying, look, you don't have to believe in this. You don't have to support me. Just promise me you won't get in the way. You won't disparage this new culture. You won't speak badly of it. But you don't have to believe in it. You don't have to be a champion of it. Just don't derail it. And by making a smaller ask, he got 100% of people on board. Either they became champions or they at least were not detractors. And that allowed him to move forward with a new culture.
Hmm. That's really interesting. And actually, it just makes me think also that that's a quite an empathetic approach. Is to actually, it kind of felt to me as you were saying, it's like, oh, that feels also like meeting people where they are. So actually, it's okay for you not to like this. You don't have to feel enthusiastic. You don't have to like jump up and down and come running for it. It's okay.
That's exactly right. Very empathetic, and also requires leaving your ego at the door a little bit,
Mm,
because you can imagine being a leader and you get so wrapped into this. You think this is exactly the strategy we need. This is wonderful. I've done so much thinking about it. And then when someone says, nah, I don't like it, it's very easy to get our ego wrapped up in it. But instead, he was actually quite practical and said, okay, if we want to get this thing done, I don't need you to be a champion. I don't need you to deeply believe it. Here's just what I need from you. And so putting ego aside in service of the change.
I love that. And putting ego aside is a theme that comes up for us a lot as well. And I've seen it. I usually talk about falling in love with the impact. When I talk about the ego and kind of setting it aside, is it's not so much about you. It's about the impact and the value and whatever else. And then the things that you want to create or the things that you've done that aren't working, they can stand aside because it's not about you. What are things that you see help people to put that ego aside? Because that's usually hard. Sometimes, we create these things and we build these programs and ideas and we kind of attach so much to them and we love them so much and we spend time on them and then we have to let go of them. And it's really hard. Even when you have all these mantras, that can be really hard. How
Something I
can we do
see,
that?
yeah, something I see all the time. In my book, I read about a meeting that I had with a recent graduate, and I love meeting with changemakers of all kinds. And so he met up with me in San Francisco. Those of your listeners that have been to San Francisco or live there know that it's very hilly and also usually pretty warm. And so he showed up for this meeting wearing a three-piece suit. And I'm a pretty casual, laid-back guy, and so I was wearing like a t-shirt and jeans. There he is in his like very fancy suit, and I could tell like, okay, this is not my normal meeting. So as we started walking up and down these huge hills in San Francisco, he's probably sweating and what am I getting myself into? I asked him, how can I help you? What are you thinking about? And he said, well, his number one goal was to be on Forbes 30 under 30. I said, okay, what would you like to have done in order to deserve that honor? And he just kind of looked around, hoping that some answer would come to him, but he had no idea. All he wanted was to be on Forbes 30 under 30, but he had no idea what he will have done to deserve it. And I think that's a metaphor for how we often think about these things and sort of our ego that, ultimately, as I told him, whether or not you get on that Forbes 30 under 30 list, you really can't control that. It'll be up to some person sitting in a conference room in New York City. They'll have probably 100 people who would be eligible and they choose 30. You can't control that. But what you can control is meaningfully choosing to serve others. It's an approach I call going beyond yourself. But this idea of how can I be of service to you and to those around you, whether that's a community, your team, someone around you, thinking about, rather than what can I get out of it, what can I do to be helpful to you? And once you do, you have to let go of control because you don't know exactly what people will say, what exactly they'll want. But if you do lean in with that, well, not only will you have more impact, but also you ironically have a better chance of getting that recognition of something like the Forbes 30 Under 30 list, because that's your better path to doing really meaningful, impactful work.
Mm, I love that. I love that you're bringing up service. I think it's a word that I see appear in much more places in the last, I can't say how last many years, but it's definitely been kind of a theme that comes up, even in the spiritual community and in the business community, this concept of being of service, which is, I think, yeah, it ties much more to contribution. And also, I always find it refreshing when there are things we talk about that move away from performance. And they are not about, perfection. It's about creating value. You meet a lot of people also who work with change. And as you're saying here, sometimes you don't even know what it is you want to achieve. How do you see that people kind of are able to pinpoint what type of movement it is they want? Because sometimes we also are coming from a place like, I want something to change, but I don't really know what. How do you even identify like the direction for it?
It can feel really overwhelming when you see the scale and scope of change, and also often just our desire to make an impact to create change. It can feel really overwhelming. And so I find that oftentimes people feel so much pressure trying to come up with exactly the right thing, especially when it feels really overwhelming to even decide. Let's say you care about climate. Well, that's a great place to do work. But even within that, there's so many areas of climate that are important and needed. And so I think I have two pieces of advice here for finding that. The first, I think it's good to pay attention to things that make you really upset, things that you feel angry about. It's oftentimes a violation of your values. And so that's something that could be sort of deeper inside of you that you feel like, oh, that just doesn't feel right. Maybe that's when people aren't treated well, maybe you really value equality or justice. And that's a sign that maybe you're onto something and maybe your change should be something related to that. But then the second one is that it's honestly very hard to figure out your change by sitting in your room by yourself and reading books or listening to podcasts. Like you've got to go out and do it. And so rather than thinking that before you take action, you have to figure out, okay, my change in the world is going to be around climate tech. That's what I'm going to do. Oh, maybe. But before you decide that, why don't you go out and do a little bit of work in that field, or try 5 different fields or 6 different areas, or maybe you care about education and try 3 different approaches to education and see what resonates. It's so hard to do unless you actually take action. And so I have to say, have a bias towards action. Give yourself the space. You don't have to have it all figured out, certainly not right away, and certainly not before you act. But go into it with some curiosity, run some experiments, and then see what resonates with you and where do you think you can actually have make a difference.
I think that this is something I also observe, maybe from a slightly different angle than you, um, that we, especially in the space of work, I think we've traditionally been very used to kind of buying everything, like the one size fits all solutions. We've been very spoiled with just going off the shelf. Here's the system, here's the solution, here's the thing. And I feel like the shift that we're in right now is exactly about this playfulness, also, or um, more iterative approach to actually, yeah, no, you don't know. You know that this is the area that's important, and you know that there are hundreds of things you could try, and you just have to start somewhere and go and try and empathize and kind of tie it into your reality and see what works. And yeah, I think it's interesting because I'm seeing this change also um in the corporate space very clearly, that you kind of have to move away from clear answers to more of a reliance on process and on being in change rather than doing changes these like 5 years, and then in the next 5 years, the next 5 years, and we'll change it and we'll sit in it. Now it's more this continuous movement, of just, constantly asking, constantly trying, constantly spotting opportunities. I feel like it's a practice on an individual level. It's practice, but then also how do you translate it into a like collective practice of continuous change where you not get stuck too much in these resistance moments, but actually kind of move through them in a way that people still feel enthusiastic and engaged.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, that's right. And that's why I like thinking about it is what I call a changemaker mindset. I
mm,
think sometimes, especially in corporates, we love to fall in love with these sort of tools. And so you learn some type of change management process and you go and you learn the 8-step model by Cotter or something like that. Um, but that kind of comes with this idea that like, okay, we run it and then our change is done. Like that's done. We've changed. But no, I think we need to have that continuous mindset. And that's where I think it's a little bit less sometimes about tools or techniques. People often ask, like, do you have a favorite change management technique? And no, honestly, I don't. I don't have a favorite. What I do focus more on instead are sort of the change maker mindset traits. And we can talk more about them, but things like resilience and curiosity and flexibility and adaptability, empathy, which I've already talked about. Those are things that if you can really focus on developing those, honing those, well, that will set you up for not just leading a single change initiative, but rather being a change maker, someone who can lead change continually throughout your life and career.
mm. I love this, and this is actually a theme I've heard with a lot of my guests is this focus on capabilities rather than specific tools or models. What have you found to be kind of then a good way to when you're saying like hone in or focus on those capabilities? How do you work on your curiosity? How do you work on your resilience? What are some of the things that you found through your years of interacting, teaching, doing research on this?
Yeah, we can share resources. Maybe some of your listeners would be interested in
Yeah.
something called Changemaker Index. And so when I first began teaching changemaking at UC Berkeley, I'm not a researcher, I'm a teacher. But I decided to do just a little bit of research and set out to try to study what are the traits that the most effective changemakers have in common, irrespective of roles or of sectors, of age. What do changemakers do to lead change? So I created this index. And it's now publicly available as part of my book. So if anyone's interested, you can go to changemakerbook.com/index and actually take it for yourself. And it'll tell you what your greatest strength as a changemaker is. I like this sort of strength-based approach. And it'll give you some insight into that. But then from there, yeah, we're starting to like understand like what are some of those traits that the best changemakers have. And the question, of course, is it teachable? Is it learnable? And the data there super clear. Yes, absolutely, you can. And so, questions what you want to learn, how you go about it. But that's really what I've dedicated my professional life at UC Berkeley to doing is teaching things like curiosity and resilience, which might feel a bit squishy or a bit fuzzy, but I think absolutely one can learn and practice.
Yeah, let's dig into that a little bit more because I think definitely both resilience and curiosity are words that are on my table and in my radar on an all, if not daily, then definitely weekly basis
Yeah.
when I talk to people. How do you how do you make curiosity like a tool for your life? Because I think uh, it's the basis of empathy as well, right? Is taking your curiosity and directing it somewhere. How do you do that?
Well, so the first thing is I really like this as just a tool, a framework, just to understand. It's something that those of your people listening have studied design thinking will probably know quite well, but it's convergent thinking and divergent thinking. So convergent thinking is the thinking that most of us do most of the time. It's this idea that there's one single right answer. Right? If I ask you, what's the capital of Germany, or how much does a panda weigh? Right? There's sort of one answer, and you just like memory recall, you put it out. Divergent thinking, meanwhile, is um, exploratory. It's divergent. It's nonlinear. It's kind of what we might call it brainstorming. But instead of coming with one single answer, you're coming up with lots of different possible answers. Now, what's fascinating is that often working with executive teams, when there's tension, I find that sometimes the team hasn't decided, are we in convergent mode or divergent mode right now? And if you have half the team that's trying to come up with one right answer, half the team that's trying to come up with new possible answers, well, there's inherent conflict there. So it can be very helpful to say, okay, look, for the next 15 minutes, let's really be focused on divergent thinking. Let's come up with a bunch of different ideas. Let's see what other people have in mind. And then from there, we can, of course, decide. So it can be actually really helpful to just be proactive about saying, yeah, we're going to do divergent thinking. The second one is one that you reference, which is just bringing in more play to what we do. It's funny, I know both you and I are parents, and play comes so naturally to our kids, but there's some point in our adult life where it's like, oh no, we no longer play. Nope, no, we got to be serious all the time. But I think some magic happens when you're willing to play. So I'm not saying that's as simple as like take a 20-minute break and play with Legos, but maybe it is. Maybe it is just like give yourself a chance to go play and to sort of be curious about things.
Mm.
There's a quote that drives me that I really love from a journalist, Kate Murray. She says that every person is interesting if you ask them the right questions. If someone seems boring, then it's on you. And so I always use that as a way as I like have conversations, whether that's someone on a plane or someone I meet at a dinner party. The idea that like go into it assuming that someone is interesting, that someone has something to teach me that I may not know, and it's my job to sort of bring it out of them. Once you think about that as a deliberate practice, it starts changing the way you think about curiosity, because it's not that there's one single right answer and there's some limited wealth of all the knowledge, but instead it's about like what can I learn from someone? How can I be curious and bring that out of them?
Hmm. Yeah, that's amazing. I think, yeah, play is, I love that you bring that up as well in terms of, I know I can't say exactly how long ago it was, but I listened to this episode on the Huberman Lab podcast, and they were, or he was alone on the episode. He was talking about play, and in particular, what it means to the adult brain, which I found was really interesting because I think we've kind of missed an opportunity sometimes in redefining what play can be when you're an adult, and you get stuck a little bit thinking like it needs to look like you're down on the floor doing things or being like playful as a child. But the way he reframed it was, it's about creating a risk-free environment where you're exploring opportunities, which allows you to open your mind. And some of it, you can do it if you're like trying to learn to dance if you're not used to it, or doing it with playing chess, or you can't have too many stakes, because it says as soon as you get adrenaline, then you basically are disrupting your ability to play. But then I thought exactly of what you're saying, is that, wow, actually, a divergent moment is play to the adult brain. And if we can just also then find moments of and ways of making it fun and kind of more fulfilling, then we're actually being playful. So yeah, when I think about that as well, is that we also have this opportunity to actually reframe a little bit what play is. And if we do, then we're actually playing maybe a lot more than we give ourselves credit for.
I love that. I hadn't heard Huberman's definition before, but what strikes me in hearing it is that it's very similar to Amy Edmondson's definition of psychological safety. She talks about psychological safety as the feeling that a team is safe for interpersonal risk taking.
Hmm.
And there's amazing data that show that the presence of psychological safety leads to greater innovation and team cohesion and all kinds of positives. But interesting to think about perhaps a connection there between like our willingness to play and our ability to feel safe. And that's
Hmm.
something that leaders of a team could then do to make sure that their team feels safe, to try new ideas, to think divergently, and to honestly just to play.
Yeah. But I like what you're bringing up here in terms of psychological safety, because there is also an element of trust in change. And especially as we talked about before, also, if you want to engage people and bring them with you, then trust is a pretty basic thing, that you need to be able to either create, or if it's already there, maintain. So that can definitely play a role. I'd love to loop back also to the word resilience, because that's definitely one that's been with me throughout many years of working with self leadership, and kind of also in relation to, there's a lot of terminology around VUCA world and that kind of connection between those. But yeah, I would love to also get your take on resilience and how do we tap into that?
Well, first, what I like to do is reframe the way we think about resilience. So I think many of us, especially here in the Bay Area, we like to think about resilience as like enduring as much pain as possible. That it's like just grind it out and just like it's going to be terrible, just get through it, get through it. But I don't think that's the right definition of resilience. Instead, the way I like to define it is staying strong for the long haul. When it comes to leading change, you got to think longer term, because as we've talked about, sometimes change will happen quickly. Oftentimes it'll take a long time and it's a up and down process. And so the question isn't about just sort of like being able to withstand a bunch of pain for 3 weeks and lead change, but rather making sure you remain strong for the long haul. I had Sid Espinoza, who at the time was the VP of philanthropy at Microsoft, come speak to my class. A student basically asked him this question, which is like, hey, I want to lead change around climate was her interest, but it feels really overwhelming and it feels like, I don't know, I'm just going to burn out on it. And he said, look, we've got to stop seeing change as an individual sprint. Instead, we've got to start seeing it as a relay race. That any of the big, meaningful changes you're trying to pursue in your life may not be solved in your lifetime. But instead, our job is to take the baton from those who have come before us. In the time we're working on it, advance the baton as much as we can. So if that's 5 years, 10 years, 15, 30, 50, 60 years. And then when the time comes to hand the baton to the next generation, make sure that we're being good stewards, that we're setting them up for success, we're mentoring them, we're supporting them, making sure that they have what they need to go. And I think when we shift from thinking about the idea that I have to do all of the change all by myself, but instead to see ourselves in the larger picture, that helps us understand, look, it's not about burning out. It's about staying strong for the long haul. Now, going hand in hand with that, I think is also reframing our relationship with failure. So we spend in my class at Berkeley, we spend an entire lecture talking all about failure because as Mia Brunell Livforce, the Swedish investor entrepreneur, told me, if you do anything meaningful, you're going to fail a lot along the way. And it's so true, especially when it comes to change. And so we spend a couple hours in the class talking about frameworks around failure. We do some case studies, look at data. But then towards the end of class, I flash up a slide which just has 2 words. And it just says, go fail.
How do people react to that?
Oh, so nervously. I'm at the front, and so I can see them react somatically. I see them start turning red. They start sweating. They start kind of laughing nervously. Like they feel really uncomfortable. Perhaps like a lot of listeners of your podcast, they're sort of high achievers and they've gotten where they are usually by doing things, quote, right, and by succeeding a lot. It's this idea of failing feels really scary to them. I flash up the next slide and it says, okay, you have 15 minutes. And you have to go leave the classroom and you can't come back until you've been rejected. You have to ask for something and purposely get someone to say no to you. And now here's where it's nice because it's a class. So they know they have to do it. And I say, look, I'll be at the front of the room. I'll coach you. I'll guide you if you need some support. But yeah, I'm serious. Go out there, go fail, and don't come back until you've been rejected. And so students, they leave the classroom and they shuffle out like nervously and try and take as long as they can. And they're scared and they're nervous. But then when they come back, the energy is just off the charts. So much so that I once had a professor next door that came over and asked us to keep the noise down because students were just so lit up from this experience. And so in doing so, we find that one of 2 things happens. For about 30% of students, they ask for something. They're sure that they'll get rejected, but they actually get a yes.
I love
I
that.
think about one woman who went to the cafe downstairs and said, hi, could I have a free orange juice? She starts turning away, expecting a no, but the barista says, yeah, okay. And she goes, okay. Could I have 2? And he goes, yeah, okay. 3? No, thankfully he cut her off there. But she came back to class with 2 orange juices for the class. And so the lesson, of course, there is that sometimes our first failure is not putting ourselves out there, that we're so sure we'll be rejected that we don't ask for something that we otherwise want and maybe we would have otherwise received. So that's about 1/3 or so of students. Then for the other 70% or so, they ask for something, they get rejected, but they come back rather than feeling defeated. They actually feel really inspired and proud of themselves. They're glad that they put themselves out on the line, that they took a chance. And they also realize that in the entire time I've done this experiment, not a single student has ever been laughed at or made fun of. We often make in our head that failure is going to be so much worse than it actually is. And I have students ask for silly things. So, one woman asked another woman to say, hi, could I put on your shoes? And she thankfully said no. Or I had one student go over to a guy who was working on like a big bulldozer and said, hi, I don't even have my driver's license, but could I drive the bulldozer? And the guy said, no, sorry, you can't do that. But they come back and they have this like boost of confidence because they put themselves out there and they realize, hey, if I could ask for something that I didn't even want, like I didn't want to wear that woman's shoes. If I could ask myself for that, then imagine what I could do when I really care about something. And it changes students' perspective about what failure actually means.
I love that. I think it reminds me of a conversation I've had with a previous guest, Maria. She's a neurologist, and we talked about the learning brain and exactly those, moments of discomfort when we're kind of faced with something. And I'm hoping I'll do justice to our explanation here, but I think what stuck with me is the fact that when you feel the discomfort, it's like this is your brain shining a flashlight on your opportunity to learn something. It's your brain telling you, hey, look, here's potential here, because there's a gap between where you are and where you could be. And if we then in that moment choose to not lean into it or do something, we're actually teaching the brain that we're not capable. Whereas if we lean into the discomfort and try, then we start building new pathways for ourselves to like actually generate a sense of belief that we
Mm.
can do it. And so, yeah, I love that you also just bake that in terms of actually creating an experience for them where they get to like push past it, not on a theoretical level, but actually on like a physical experience level, because it can have such a big impact on just moving past that threshold.
Yeah, and a threshold is a nice way to think about it. It's perhaps in line with the way Murray thinks about it. But in my teaching, like as we think about pedagogy, I'm a big believer that there's this like magic moment of growth that happens. You think about it as like a big circle. In the middle of the circle, you've got the place where you're just too comfortable, where things are just too easy, where you're not sort of being challenged. And you just, you're fine. You'll get an A in the class. Things are just easy. Then there's also towards the outer part of the circle, this area which is just too scary, where it's just too big of a leap and you don't feel equipped to do it. And it feels just like, I can't possibly go there. The place I try to be in my teaching is right at that magic intersection, that inflection point where they feel just safe enough, but also just scared enough. And I think there's a lot of amazing growth that happens right at that tipping point. Now, it's not easy to get to there, but I think when we think not about being too much into too safe and not just throwing ourselves into the deep end where it's too scary, but titrating to that perfect moment, that's where a lot of growth happens.
Yeah, I've had a mantra around like leaning into your edge for several
Mm,
years. Is just when you're feeling like you're just there, then you lean in. And as you say, also, it can't be too big because then it's really threatening for us. And we also, then we kind of just want to go hide and pull a blanket over our heads. And that's not also not a good place to be. But definitely subjecting ourselves to a little bit of discomfort can definitely help us develop that sense of resilience and sense of belief that we're actually capable of doing things.
exactly. Yeah.
Amazing. What I'm thinking is also that, now we touched on like a lot of different topics. We talked about resilience, creativity, engaging people, empathy, all kinds of things. So maybe let's boil it down to like just a few little tips. Um, and I'm thinking my one question is I have two actually. So let's do them one by one. One is if you're a person in a place where there is change going on, whether or not you're leading it, what can you do to contribute to movement and making that easy?
So I think part of it is recognizing where you might be in that model that Nobel talked about. So are you a champion? Are you a fence sitter? A cynic? And there's roles for
Mm.
each of those and sort of understanding where your place is. But then also one of my favorite videos that I show in class is called Leadership Lessons from the Dancing Guy. And it shows how this dance movement at a music festival happened with one crazy guy who was dancing by himself. But then the magic happens when this guy they call the first follower came aboard. So this one shirtless dancing guy is dancing by himself for a few seconds. But then this other guy comes and joins, dances for a few seconds, and then he calls to his friends and says, hey, come check this out. And that's the turning point. That first follower turned this way Derek Sivers says a lone nut into a movement.
Mm.
And so what you might think about is there a role for you to be the first follower? There's sometimes you'll be the crazy dancing guy, and that's great. Maybe you're the one that's on the edge. Most of us probably aren't that way. But can you pay attention to other people who are doing something interesting or a change that you believe in? And then can you be willing to put a little bit of your own privilege on the line to make it safe for others to be part of it with you, to validate
Mm.
it, to invite others to be part of it, to not take over the change, but to be of service, to help support that change? And so think about perhaps there's a role you can play, not to be the crazy dancing guy. You don't necessarily have to start the change, but find some change, find a spark, and then help to turn it into a bigger flame.
Oh, I love that. And I've seen that video. It's really it's really engaging. And a second question then is, because I always look at change or anything that's ongoing, it's always this, as we talked about, this parallel movement between what happens in the collective space and the things that we bring in and our capabilities. So yeah, I'm curious, just let's just kind of try and sum up, like, what are some core things that maybe that you practice or that you see that have a lot of success with your students that you can practice to hone in on your own skills to cope with change or drive change?
Well, the first is one that's just super practical, but it's a concept I call micro change. So before you go out and launch your own social enterprise, you got to get comfortable with smaller change as well. And so I encourage all of my students, executives that I work with, to practice small change all the time. So what does this look like? It's committing to changing up your routine in small ways. And by the way, this makes people really uncomfortable, even though it's a small change, but that's the whole point of this, right? So maybe for an entire week, you only eat breakfast foods for dinner and only dinner foods for breakfast. Maybe every day driving your kids to school, you take a different route.
Mm.
Maybe you let your best friend choose your and create your Spotify playlist, and you only listen to their music for an entire week. Or the one that really freaks people out is if you have a partner or spouse, switch sides of the bed with them for a week.
Oh, I felt that one. Yeah.
Right, so all tiny little aspects of micro change, just for a week, small little things, and that just builds up a bit of your confidence in yourself, your ability to navigate smaller bits of change. That way, when the time comes for bigger change, you feel like you have a bit more resilience to lean on.
Yeah, so you're actually kind of playing with change in this space of, yeah, little less risk, but just building your tolerance.
I
Small
think
change.
that's enough to make listeners a bit uncomfortable with their change and to give them some things to try. So I think that's a great place from which to start.
A great place to start. I think this is fabulous. Lots of super concrete tips to deal with change, to drive change, to be a leader of it. Any last words of wisdoms that you want to send to our listeners?
That the world has never been more ready for you. I think there's never been a better, more important time to find your own potential as a change maker and to lead change for yourself and for others. There are big, scary changes out in the world, but there's also lots of huge opportunity. And so my invitation to you is to find your own agency, to find your own ability to lead change and to step up and create positive change for yourself and for those around you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing all of your wisdom and your enthusiasm for change, because that's definitely the spark that you were talking about that is felt also through you. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. This was a really fun conversation.
Thank you for listening to The Experienced Designers. I hope this episode brought you some new insight and some new topics to stop and wonder about. A special thanks to Alex for sharing his concrete tips, exercises, and enthusiasm for change. Don't forget to click subscribe, and as always, get in touch with any questions or suggestions. That's how better experiences are made.